So there was a question that I asked early on in the season of Epiphany. And some of you will remember I asked, what does it take to come to know Jesus? Or I think the way I asked it was, what does it mean? What does it look like to have your life changed by the gospel? And we have been holding that question alongside the issue of immigration and the response of a Christ follower to the crisis, the national emergency at the border. The story of the transfiguration of Jesus has so much to tell us, but it's too much to do all in a Sunday, especially a communion Sunday. So we're going to take just one tiny piece of it today and come back to other parts of this story next week. The scripture from Exodus is great background because the folks who put together the lectionary are giving us background information on what it is the disciples are experiencing. We know now that this has happened before, that God has been experienced on a mountaintop, and in fact, one of these friends who shows up with Jesus, Moshe himself, has experienced this God on a mountaintop. And now we see Jesus on the mountaintop with his disciples. And let's remember where Jesus has been. So prior to this, Jesus has been really exegeting the gospel for people. He's been laying out the good news, what he's about to follow in life, the work that he is going to do. And you'll remember that just before he has already been on a hill. He went on a hill, he prayed, he gathered his disciples, and then he came down the mountain to start explaining to the people, to the poor fishing community gathered around the Sea of Galilee, what he was about and what he was going to do and what it meant that he was going to turn the world right side up. So this scene that we arrive at today, the Transfiguration, it follows Jesus really articulating the most clearly in the Gospel of Luke his mission. And it's about identity and call, who he is and what he's going to do in the world, what he's been called to. So we have Jesus on the mountaintop, and his face is radiating. It says his face was changed. And the word in the Hebrew that's used for that encounter Moses has on the mountaintop with God, when it says his face is radiating, it doesn't mean his face is glowing. It's a bit more freakish. The imagery is that there are horns protruding from Moses' face. That radiating is an odd experience. Something has gone on with Moses' face that isn't like he put on his primer and his blusher that morning. He is so changed. He has some kind of light shining out of his face in spikes, which is, frankly, the reason for the veil, because that would be a little bit terrifying to check into day after day. So the Greek word is different. I don't know if Jesus had spikes coming out of his face or not, but I guess not. Because that would have presented a different kind of situation for him. But Jesus is glowing, and he's with Moses and Elijah. He's with these two people, the undead. This is a strange experience for the disciples to be bearing witness to. There's voices from heaven, and the disciples, we know from this story, they're sleepy, they're terrified, and they're really confused. They do not understand. They can't make sense of this experience that they're having with Jesus. And the next scene in the story is Jesus coming down from the mountain with the disciples. And many commentators will say these two scenes don't seem to be related at all, so they'll separate them in the lectionary. And you have the Transfiguration as one Sunday, and these other verses, I think it's maybe 38 to 42, are separate as a different story. Jesus comes down off the mountain, and he's met by the father of a child who is possessed by a demon. The text says he convulses day and night. This boy is in psychological distress, in social chains. Demons had taken hold of his life, and the disciples apparently haven't been able to deal with it. So the man's father asks Jesus to save his son. One way of thinking about what was going on there is that the disciples hadn't been quite transfigured enough on that mountaintop. They hadn't been changed enough by this exposition of God's identity and who Jesus is. They encounter Jesus, but they walk away confused and tired and scared. They haven't really grasped Jesus' identity or the identity of God on that mountaintop. They hadn't been changed enough to do this healing that was requested of them. And I wonder about us. Have we been transfigured enough to be healers? Do we understand enough about the transfiguration of Jesus to understand our own transfigurations? As the disciples continue the journey with Jesus, as he sets his face toward Jerusalem and all that is to come that Moses and Elijah were warning him about on that mountaintop, the disciples begin an exodus where they are going to start to see Jesus, to know Jesus. But for them, this doesn't take place in that moment of mystery, that strangeness of the transfiguration on the mountaintop. It begins to take place as they follow Jesus down the mountain and into the suffering of the world, where they meet that demon-possessed child and the father who's desperate for his son to be returned to him. And you remember where we are. We're not far from the level place text. And what's that about? Do you remember? Blessings and woes, and God says, Jesus says, you're going to be in the level place. This is where you are. This is where you live. In level place, our brains might like to wrap that up with a pretty bow and say it has something to do with equality. But remember that the level plane is the place of corpses, of the dead, of the suffering, of the demonic. And that is exactly the realm that Jesus says, go there. That's where you will encounter me and the blessing. I have folks who volunteered to help me this morning. If you volunteered to be some helpers, Ed and Karen, and I need Trina, and I need maybe just one more per Amber. Can you help? So there are 2 baskets of, I think they're mandarins. I don't really know. I'm always confused. What is this fruit? Is it a mandarin? Is it tangerine? Is it an orange? It's a citrus of some kind. It's a citrus. So I am hoping that we can pass these baskets sort of down the aisle and disperse the mandarins. So maybe take the citrus item in your hands, and I want you to just sort of check it out. Just look at it. Use the senses of sight, of the way your hands feel holding the fruit. What do you know about it? Elizabeth smelled it. Can you smell it? What do you smell? What can you know about this thing you're holding in your hands? If I asked you to draw it, what's unique about it? It's orange. It's a sphere. It has dimples. It's small. Oh, there's a place where it was connected to something, so now it's disconnected from a hole. It's cold. You're going to get your napkin, and I'm going to ask you to explore that orange a little further. by doing what Jack and Mary were trying to do. Peel the orange. You can collect your peelings in your napkin, and I'll tell you what we're going to do with those later. But peel the orange, and then tell me what you know about it. It smells good. Has sections. It's moist. Segmented. Has anyone taken a bite? I'm going to guess that you know more about the orange now than you did when you were just looking at it. Do you feel like that's a true statement? Yeah. Okay. And it's truly radiating throughout the space. Like, we all know something about your orange because I can smell it from here, and I don't have one. And I think this is like what it is to know Jesus. It takes digging in, not just observing, but engaging the world, the real places where Jesus is, to come to know Jesus, to come to understand how the gospel might change your life. You can't just be a passive observer, because you'll have one experience of the gospel. But until you're willing to peel the orange and get the juice on your fingers, you won't know the fullness of the good news. Well, we know that all around us, the world is convulsing, right? We know that story of the demon. We know that people are driven by hunger and despair and abandonment every day. We know that the homeless and the immigrant, they're convulsing day and night right in front of us, right in front of us. It's only if we're willing to recognize God in that suffering that we're going to be transformed, transfigured by the gospel. The disciples didn't get it, because when the Father came saying, "Return my son to me and heal him of the demon," the disciples couldn't see that God was there at work in the child's suffering and in the Father's suffering. If we're only willing to observe, to stay on the mountaintop, then we will always have an impoverished view of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. But if we can come down the mountain and encounter the real lived places, that level plain, the places where, the demons are, but God is also there, we will experience the fullness of the transfiguration. Amen.